Hello and welcome to Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. From shock therapy to poverty elimination, from Millennium Development Goals to now Sustainable Development Goals, Jeffrey Sachs, a renowned economist from Columbia University, has been a strong advocate. The huge experiments he has been doing worldwide in search of new solutions to long-term problems have been encouraging a lot of times, but controversial the other times. So how far is the world from achieving its sustainable development ambition? Can experiments in one place or one country be applied elsewhere? Can success be guaranteed in that regard? What is going to be China's role on this long march to look for solutions? Joining us here in the studio, of course, is Jeffrey Sachs, director of the Columbia University's Earth Institute. He's also a special advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and to several African governments. Professor Sachs, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you so much.
I have to use a quote from one of your opponents. While you are searching for solutions to some of the biggest problems in the world, they say you have long stopped being an academic and turned yourself into a propagandist. Do you agree with what they said?
Well, that's very foolish. I'm both an academic and a practitioner. And unfortunately, some of the critics are only sitting in their offices making complaints, where I've been out in the world for a quarter century making positive change together with the people all over the world. And I've seen positive change, and those people in their offices ought to get out of their offices and go see the real world.
Also get out of their offices if they were going to do that. What they are going to see is the economic realities in this world. Namely, we're still in the middle of this crisis. Nobody knows when the world is going to climb out of it. With that regard, how could some of the social economic experiments you've been doing, which would cost a lot of money, can have a new horizon in the near term?
We've seen a lot of progress in the last 25 years. Of course,
such as what?
China has by itself made historic progress, and the developing world as a whole has more than cut poverty by the goal that was set back in 2000 by more than half. So the poverty rate of developing countries as a whole was about 45% in 1990. Now it's about 20%. China accounts for a lot of that progress, but we're seeing a fall of poverty all over the developing world, including in Africa now. Many of the things that I've advocated are being done, and they're having a hugely beneficial effect. For example, malaria coming under control in Africa, more people with AIDS and other diseases being treated. And so we see large gains, and the world has the resources to make monumental historic achievements to end poverty once and for all. We're on that path. We just have to persevere. A lot of China's great experiences can be used throughout the world.
2 points to follow up. One is whether China is exceptional in a way, because this is a huge country, 1.3 billion people, potentially a huge market. And of course, the political system in this country is quite different from many of the other countries which are facing poverty alleviation issues. On the other hand, there's also the issue of speed. On the one hand, China has been proud of the speed it has been applied in terms of its development. On the other hand, China is also now facing the side effect of this really dramatic fast speed in which economic development is much advanced. However, the social development, ethical development is lacking behind. 2 points I want you to respond.
These are excellent points. Of course, Africa, for example, has 49 countries south of the Sahara Desert in the sub-Saharan region. That's how many borders, how many difficulties of cooperation. So China has an advantage in being able to have a national policy and being able to implement it. And when you have 49 separate countries, even you can't move goods across the borders so easily. The roads don't connect. The rail networks are all separated and the power distribution separated. So the integration of the African region is a big challenge. It's a political challenge because the colonial powers divided up Africa into all these little units.
Have you ever searched for any solutions for that?
Well, I work all the time on Africa Union scale change. So you look at political agreements at the level of the whole continent, and I work with the regions, for instance, in East Africa, so that the countries are cooperating on building the rail networks together. This takes time. It would be easier if there were not the colonial legacy of 49 separate small countries that are divided arbitrarily.
But you have to work with reality.
You do what you can, exactly. You work with what there is. You don't pretend something different. You don't sit in your office and say, I imagine a world that's different, or you don't sit in your office and say, well, that's impossible. You work with what you have. When it comes to speed, this is also really an important point. China's moved very fast. It's made huge economic progress, the fastest in human history. But on the other hand, now the air and the water is highly polluted. There are many social problems and so forth. My view is that economic development is a process. So you go fast in a direction and then you learn. You see, oh, there are mistakes, there are things that are left off, there are adjustments that need to be made. For instance, I argue in China right now that a major effort should be made in cleaning the air and the water. Don't wait any longer. And in fact, I think the wait has been too long.
They cannot afford to wait any longer.
Exactly.
In fact, at this moment already.
When you breathe the air in Beijing, you know it's time to move. But this doesn't mean that going fast was wrong. It means that when you move fast, you have to be very open to learning, to adjustment, to taking a new course. And China's quite good at that. And I think that the idea of planning and looking ahead is extremely important, and being flexible to adjust, to change course. When you see this has gone so far this way, now we should move in a somewhat different direction because of new circumstances.
Right, but experiments like these could always be very controversial, not only in one country's politics, but also worldwide. Take China once again example, the family planning policy, which you has been praising over the past few years, in fact has been a controversial one. And now you've seen the international debates surrounding that. Some argue it is impossible to have that implemented in a politically different society, in a religious and culturally different society. And then on the other hand, now China is also feeling the side effect of this family planning policy because of the shortage, as some say, of labor in this country, and also the enormous challenges of the taking care of the elderly, while this the single child family is growing bigger and bigger around this country. So social experiments like these could be successful for short term, but when it comes to long term, some say, you still see huge side effects. I want to have your views on this and how, if any, China's so-called experiences can be applied elsewhere in the world.
Well, this is an excellent question. I have no doubt that China's reduction of fertility rates has been a huge benefit for China, in the sense of enabling much faster economic growth. And even with all the pressures on the environment, they would be so much worse if China's population were not 1.3 billion, but 1.8 billion or 2 billion, almost unimaginable. So I think that the slowdown of population growth and its almost stabilization now, and probably it will decline actually in absolute numbers of Chinese population in the second half of the 21st century, has been very beneficial for China. You think about families that may have had 6 or 7 children traditionally, and depending if they're in the countryside or the city, have 1 or 2 children. The result has been how much investment parents have put into the education of 1 child or 2 children. And so what we've seen in China is in 1 generation, this tremendous increase of education levels of the population. We've never seen anything like this in history. I think this will serve China very well. But when it comes to how to get that fertility decline. Definitely other countries won't follow China's policy. Even when I said some countries maybe should think about having really emphasizing 3 children in Africa, they said, no, can't do that. But my view is that if countries are serious about their development, they do need to reduce high fertility rates. They need to encourage families. They need to make sure that families have access to family planning and so forth. But that seems to prove some
of what your critics have been saying, that the experiments you've been doing, or huge social experiment that China has been doing, it's not necessarily going to be that helpful for other countries.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say that.
Because are so different.
I wouldn't say that. I'd say that you can learn and then apply the lessons to local context. Now, you have to be good at that. I think I'm pretty good at it, by the way, because I've been doing this now in more than 100 countries over more than a quarter century. And so experience counts. I feel a little bit like a doctor. I've described what I do as being a clinical economist. And what that means is that a patient comes, or you go to see a patient, there's an ill. A good doctor doesn't say that there's one diagnosis. A good doctor says, I've seen 1,000 patients with various kinds of complaints, and yours seems like this. Let's do some tests. Let's find out what makes sense for you, but not neglecting all the lessons that you have around. And since we all share similar technologies, we all produce electricity in roughly the same ways, or drive cars, or have rail, we can learn a lot from what other countries have done, how they've done it. But it doesn't mean that you simply take from one place and apply it to someplace else.
That's only one example we can share with our audience, which is the example of China. What about the other example, the shock therapy, for example? That has been an idea advocated back in the 1990s, and you were one of those advocates for the idea. Of course, it worked, apparently well in Poland.
Yes, very
However, not well at all in Russia. Though one could find many similarities between these two economies and two societies, but there are also differences. So once again, the question about the experiences and the lessons you get from one country, is it going to be really useful to the other country? If not, or if mostly not, any of the social experiment we've been doing now worldwide, is it going to really pay us off?
I'll give you an interesting example. In Poland, the advice I gave was implemented, and it worked very, very well. Poland became the fastest growing economy in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989. It had a big success. So I recommended a number of things for Russia to President Gorbachev and to President Yeltsin. But what was different was when I recommended it for Poland, the United States said, yes, we'll support that. When I recommended it for Russia, the United States said, no support. It was politics. It wasn't economics that was playing a role. The United States didn't want to help Russia. It wanted to help Poland. It made a very big difference. If Russia had gotten more help, they would have had an easier time with this very difficult transition that they had. So this is a matter sometimes of politics. I'm an economist. I give advice, but whether the advice is accepted or not is quite a different matter. And I saw how geopolitics was playing a role. I disagreed with it. I think what Mr. Bush and Mr. Clinton did vis-a-vis Russia in the 1990s was a big mistake, because if they had helped more, it would have been a smoother reform, and I think Russia would have been better off and the world would have been better off. They didn't want to help at the time. They still had a Cold War mentality.
That's an interesting perspective of looking at that issue. We're going to continue our discussion, Professor Sachs, about many other experiments that you are doing and the world should be doing.
Wonderful.
Right after this break. We'll be right back.